Hello everyone, I am Aditya Vidhate, 2014 B5A70775H, a member of the alumni engagement team at BITSA and also your host for this podcast. This podcast is a part of the COVID Talk series. This series addresses the current pandemic all of us are living, or must I say surviving through, by getting under the spotlight some amazing Bitsians doing some amazing work to help humanity make it through. One such amazing Bitsian I am sitting with for this podcast is Vibhav Joshi, a 2015 graduate from BIT Goa, dual major in EEE and Bio. He founded the healthcare tech company Sattva MedTech with his batchmate Sumed Kaulgud. They received their seed funding from BIT's 75 Charitable Trust. In 2019, their startup merged with Inaxel and Koyo Labs to form Inaxel Technologies, where Vibhav is currently the co-founder and director. Inaxel is India's leading medical device startup with 6 products across domains like critical care, or as we commonly understand, ICU, child and maternal healthcare, and ENT surgery. And they have raised a total of $4 million in equity and grant funding. 3 of their products are deployed to directly fight on the front lines of COVID-19 by helping save lives and reducing infections. So Vibhav, I have this curious question, right? What exactly does Inaxel do and what is the purpose and vision of the company?
Hi Aditya and hello everyone. I would like to thank you all for inviting me to the podcast. So Inaxel started off as a company to build medical devices for the emerging world because we realized at that point that a lot of devices which are designed for the Western world are not designed for the kind of skill levels you will find in India and are not designed for the kind of resource constraints you would have in healthcare settings in India. So India and emerging markets required certain specific design considerations as well as price and training and other considerations. So that was the sort of seed of building medical devices for the emerging world. And we very quickly realized that a lot of advantages you would have when you design for the emerging world actually result in advantages for the developed world as well. So then our vision sort of turned towards building in India for the emerging world and then scaling globally. And we obviously worked across multiple domains. We identified specific problems in ICU care. So for example, we have a product called WAPcare, which is used to support patients who are on the ventilator to remove secretions that pool within their lungs and their endotracheal tube, which can lead to infections and therefore death. So about 30% of ICU deaths are actually caused by a disease called VAP, ventilator-acquired pneumonia. So we have a product to clean up those secretions and therefore help those patients survive. Then our product, Fetal Light, is a product that is used for fetal monitoring. That is to measure the baby's health during labor. And it's designed specifically for Indian conditions where you'll have healthcare staff that probably may not be able to identify the fetal heart location or have several other challenges. And we sort of deal with them through design and algorithms and innovation. And our third major product, which is now for COVID specifically, is called SARS Pro, which is basically a non-invasive ventilation device. So WAPcare is in use in COVID for patients who have gone on ventilators. Fetal Light, because it's very portable and easy to use, we are deploying for home monitoring so that moms don't have to visit hospitals, and therefore we limit the number of times they interact with potential infection sites. And SARS Pro directly helps patients who have COVID with their breathing and support them through the recovery.
That's great, Vibhav. So during the current pandemic, I have noticed the lack of ventilators in hospitals being a major concern across countries, not just India, right? Can you briefly tell us what exactly a ventilator is and why are ventilators so important during COVID?
Right. Let's first begin a bit with COVID disease management, right? Because that is the context in which a ventilator suddenly became so important.
Right.
So COVID basically is a virus that is attacking your upper respiratory system and specifically your lungs. So what it does is the virus goes and it starts attacking alveoli. Alveoli are like small balloons, a lot of which balloons make up your lung. And these balloons sort of start crumpling or killing themselves, and their walls start collapsing. And that is basically what leads to the acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS. Now, what is happening is one, your capacity of the lung is reducing, and the surface area that the lung has for oxygen exchange is also reducing. And the main clinical management that's happening today in all hospitals is, since we don't have a vaccine which can kill the virus, we are trying to manage the body and its response, and give the body enough time so that it can automatically on its own become immune, right? It can develop immunity. So the way to do this is to keep supporting the lungs up to the point that the body can effectively fight back with the virus. Now, of all the COVID patients, about 20 to 25% patients get to a stage where they need to be hospitalized. And of that group, half of them would probably develop ARDS, acute distress syndrome, and 3 to 4 to 5% of those may need to go onto the ventilator depending on how bad the situation gets. So what is a ventilator now? So ventilator is basically a lung support mechanism. So it gives a constant pressure of air and oxygen for you to breathe in, and it also gives a constant sort of reverse pressure to mimic breathing out. So it's basically doing the job of your lungs. It's doing the job of pushing and pulling at air that your lung is supposed to do, because your lung is itself not capable of doing. That's at a very sort of meta level what a ventilator does. Now, why are there so few ventilators? Because in a non-pandemic world, you don't need that many ventilators. Not so many patients develop such acute sort of disease state where their lungs stop functioning effectively, right? So a standard ICU, let's say in Bangalore, you have NH, Narayana Hrudayalaya. They have a 30-40 bed ICU, of which 11 to 12 beds have ventilators. And NH is a fairly high-end center. So most hospitals will have one or two centers, tertiary care hospitals will have one or two ventilators, because that's the kind of patient volume they see generally. Now, obviously in the pandemic, which is attacking the lungs, the number of patients who require ventilators obviously suddenly jumped up, and we are not prepared for that kind of eventuality.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Thanks for that simple explanation. You really cleared out a lot of things. So the follow-up question to this, right? Why are there so few ventilators? I mean, I think that your previous answer sort of explains it, because you're saying, hardly many patients require the use of a ventilator at any point.
In an ideal world, there would be more ventilators, because you'd probably give more patients the option of having ventilation. Right now, sometimes you manage with other ways. The reason for that is ventilators, like really high-end quality ones, are, I won't say difficult to build, but they are difficult to build at scale. You have your pressure support for giving oxygen or air. You have pressure support for the exhalation function. But then there's a fairly complicated control system. Now, all of these pressure within a hospital setup needs to come from a central sort of air supply, right? So you have an oxygen line, you have a normal air line, or you'll have specific cylinders. Now, there might be some variation in their outputs. So your system has to be built to safeguard against that. The patient condition may deteriorate over time. So the exchange at the cannula or at the mask level, there might be variations. So your system should be intelligent enough to deal with those kind of differences. So the control system is not too complicated, but needs to be very, very safe. So a lot of testing has to happen to make sure it can work in all kinds of edge cases. Then you also need a lot of filters to make sure that there's not cross contamination of air. Those need to be changed with time. So there needs to be alert mechanisms, stuff like that. So overall, it's a complex system that needs to go through very, very stringent regulatory testing. That is one. Now, building one or two or three prototypes, medical devices, is not such a big task. But the moment you say, okay, now I have a functional prototype, but now I want to scale production to 1,000 units. That's where the big sort of knowledge gap is, and that's why so few companies are good at making ventilators. Also, your standard high-end ventilators in India cost anywhere from 12 to 15 lakhs. So not all hospitals set up will purchase them in bulk. So those are some
Right.
other reasons why we don't have a lot of those.
Mm-hmm. All right, makes sense. So are these ventilators difficult to build? And so if they are, how is your product SaaS Pro, which I think does the job of a ventilator, right? How is it different from normal ventilators that we have in hospitals?
So let me put it this way: any novel medical device that you want to develop, right? So for us, we developed Fetal Light. It took us 3.5 years from identifying sort of the clinical gap to building the first prototype that we could effectively place in a hospital for independent use. And in that 3.5 year cycle, there was a lot of iterations. There was regulatory testing. We had to undergo CE certification. We had to set up manufacturing. So and even beyond those 3.5 years, once we actually placed it in the market, a lot of feedback came that there was usability problems. Nurses were not happy with some sort of features, so we had to modify them. So till it became sort of stable and easy to use and ready to scale, it took us 4.5 years. After which it was fairly easy for us to start selling. So I would say that any moderate difficulty medical device has a 5 year sort of gestation period, right? It just takes that amount of time because it's hardware. There's a lot of regulation around safety protocols. You have to identify materials that are safe for the body. You have to do those sort of regulatory tests. So I would categorize a ventilator as slightly above moderate complexity in terms of being able to design and build, right? So ideally, let's say there is a company that has no experience whatsoever of ventilation devices or oxygen support devices, and they wanted to start building a ventilator from scratch. For them to build and deploy a very, very stable, safe to use product, even with accelerated timelines and a lot of money, would be a 2.5, 3 year cycle at least, right? Now,
Oh yeah, that's a long time. Yeah.
yeah, that's a long cycle. The advantage we had was that one of our products, it's so the predecessor to SaaS Pro, it's called SaaS. We
Right.
had built that as a CPAP, a constant pressure system for neonates, so for babies. So we had a lot of experience in terms of designing portable battery powered oxygen and air supply systems. So we already had a lot of that know-how. We did not have to start from scratch. So the moment we realized a bit more data started coming about how COVID works and where the gap is, and we obviously also talked to a lot of doctors. The feedback we got was that the clinical management idea here is to not let so many patients go onto the ventilator, because going onto a ventilator has several risk factors of their own, right? The patients who go on the ventilator, basically you are taking away their lung function entirely. So their lungs may not recover enough, or they may develop other infections such as ventilator acquired pneumonia, which may end up killing them rather than COVID. So we would want to stop patients from going onto the ventilator altogether as much as possible. So we wanted to play in that sort of management area. So our system, basically we decided that, okay, we need to upgrade this, which we have designed for the neonates lungs. We want to change the pump and the output settings and the airflow settings and the oxygen level settings so that we can support the adult lung. Okay. So we basically took our old design. We made modifications in terms of getting better pump systems, changing the filters, changing the outlet design, which took us a bit of time. I would say 4 to 5 weeks before we got that functional prototype, and we could deploy it in the hospital. But we could only do it that fast because we had a lot of experience. So now we are able to give a portable system which you can which comes midway in the intervention. So patients who have some respiratory distress can be put on the CPAP, that is our device, and therefore we stop them from worsening, which stops them from going on the ventilator.
I see. So when you say portable, so I recall, if I understand correctly, you said ventilators draw their air from a central supply. So when
Right.
you say your device is portable, is your device driving air from like a portable supply?
We built it in a modular way so that you can obviously also always put in a hospital air supply, oxygen supply line, or you can have an air cylinder and oxygen cylinder of a smaller volume, which you can sort of keep on a trolley. So you have a portable trolley that you can take around. Or let's say in an ambulance, you generally have a oxygen and air cylinder, so you can put our unit there supplied. So we have more sort of control on kinds of inputs we are able to take, and our sort of IP and expertise is in giving a constant positive output pressure. So that's where our IP is. So whatever variability happens in the input supply, our IP makes certain that the output is always constant. So that way the doctor is very, very confident of the outcome.
Right. So what is the reason that the ventilators that are currently there in the hospital are not portable?
Because nobody really thought of making portable ones so far.
Oh, I see.
I
Okay.
mean, so the whole market is designed for ICU care, and
Right.
therefore you have this sort of design paradigm that, okay, my ventilator basically sits in the ICU.
Makes
Because
sense.
these are designed for the Western world, right? These are designed primarily for the US, the UK,
Right.
those kind of markets where you have very stringent guidelines on how hospitals are built, right? But you go to 10 hospitals in India, every hospital has a different infrastructure, different kind of ICU,
Yeah.
supply line is somewhere like, okay, we are standardized to an extent, but we are not as stringent. So these were basically never designed for a use case where portability may be a concern, right? But for us, when we designed SaaS, we thought from a portability angle because we wanted to support transport from, let's say, a village to a tertiary care center.
Right.
So the DNA of the system from get-go was to be portable, and therefore we could use all of that expertise in making SaaS Pro also portable. So from identifying the material for the chassis,
Right. Yeah.
identifying how do we make a cheap but very sturdy outer sort of casing. How do we make sure that screwing, unscrewing is easy for a service engineer to do on the field? So a lot of those sort of design paradigms were meant for portable units.
Yeah. Understood. So your ground up purpose itself was essentially was built
Yeah,
around portability entirely.
yeah,
And that those are not the principles around which traditional ventilators are built, because the use case that these people are thinking about is just to sit in a hospital.
exactly.
Makes sense. So how did you test the performance of your product? As far as I understand, clinical tests are difficult to go through, right? So how do you get your device certified for clinical use, and how difficult, or I mean, rarely easy is the process?
Okay, so again, let me start with a standard scenario where you are developing something for the first time altogether, right? Then you, depending on the disease profile, depending on the patients that your product works on, depending on whether your product is invasive, non-invasive. So a lot of permutation combinations, you sort of define your uh, verification and validation pathway, right? So what you do is you say, okay, my device needs to meet at least these safety criteria before it goes on the patient. And these criteria are sort of tied to internationally available standards. So you have something called ISO 13485 that is for all companies which want to medical device companies that want to sell in the EU. ISO 13485 is a design and development sort of standard. Then you have CE MDR, which is a European standard. For the US, you have US FDA and 21 CFR. So basically, internationally, for all kinds of products and devices, there are fairly well written and stringent standards that you have to comply with. So if you're able to comply with them and you are able to do a lot of benchtop testing, then you have that as baseline data to be able to put it on a human, right?
Right.
So that process of complying, building units, doing bench testing is about a 2-year process from get-go. And then you basically have to go to a hospital, say that, okay, it's an experimental device, but it's safe because it complies to XYZ standards. And now you want to put it on a patient and prove efficacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a standard clinical pathway, including the ethics committee approval, plus the trial, plus the analysis, would often by itself be a 1.5-year cycle. So medical device development, it's not so difficult is not the right word to describe clinical proof. or clinical evaluation. It's just that you have to comply. You have to be very, very stringent about putting all the data together, and you need to get the relevant permissions. Therefore, you need to develop relationships with hospitals. You have to build a clinical protocol, all of those things. Now, again, in this scenario, we had a specific advantage that we had already built a SaaS product for neonates, which is already commercially available, right? So we had gone through the cycle of the benchtop testing for that. We had done the clinical evaluation. We had about 150 patients worth of data, neonatal patient data. So in terms of concept and the rest of the safety sort of compliances, we already had a lot of that data. Now, basically, we had to look at the delta. Okay, I'm modifying my device now for adults. So I'm changing these three base components. I'm changing these output settings. And therefore, for adults, these are the new standards. So we had to do a delta sort of benchtop testing first, which took, because you obviously again had a lot of this experience, took 2 to 3 weeks. And then once we had that data, because you're in a pandemic situation and there is massive demand for any kind of oxygen support device out there, we are able to quickly get access to multiple hospitals where people were willing to do sort of emergency use trials. So that way we got our device into some 7 hospitals now, where all doctors have been very impressed. We have letters from the private sector, we have letters from the public sector that multiple patients have been put on this device, their SpO2 oxygen levels have increased over time, and now they are recovered. So that way, a combination of us already having previous patient and benchtop data, and then this emergency circumstance made the sort of clinical part of it sort of easier. But obviously, we were very, very hesitant to put anything in the field before we had done significant benchtop testing.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like not a difficult, but a long and sort of meticulous process.
Yeah. So the challenge here is that what would generally take you, let's say, 6 months, you need to do in 4 to 5 weeks. And the other challenge that we have been facing, obviously, has been with the supply chain, right? Because everybody in the world is making ventilators now. So previously, there was relatively lesser demand for, let's say, a flow meter. Now there are 40 companies bidding for the same flow meter, and the supply has not really jumped up that much. So securing those, making sure that they're clearing through customs and dealing with the lockdown. So we're also dealing a lot with the supply side issues. So that's where the real challenge was for us.
Right, makes sense. So do you think increasing the number of ventilators, let's say suddenly we have, magically we have a lot more ventilators than we have right now. Do you think that is going to drastically and significantly affect the COVID situation that we are dealing with? I understand it will definitely help because we will have many more, sort of critical care units deployed. But as you said, right, a ventilator does not necessarily save life. It might be your lungs might become reliant on the ventilator. And another major thing which might become is that ventilator associated pneumonia, right? So do you think if magically, let's say, I flood the market with ventilators, do you think the COVID situation, it helps the COVID situation in any significant manner right now?
The answer to that is we don't really have enough data to make a judgment. At a logical level, having more ventilators is definitely required, right? Because a fair amount of patients are getting to a stage where ventilator is the only option for them to survive, right? Ventilators generally have in the COVID scene, I think 30 to 40% chance that you would recover, otherwise not. But even to be able to give that 30% chance, you need to have a ventilator there, right? If the patient has gone to the extent where ventilator is the only option, yes, we need to have a ventilator. But to the extent possible, we should avoid putting a patient on a ventilator. In any scenario, even in a normal ICU setting, ventilator is always a last option.
Right, makes sense. Yeah, but that the point you made, right, that really took me, that we do not have enough data. So India, right, talking about India and COVID, do you think India as a country was prepared for such a large scale pandemic in general? Forget about COVID, for example. But let's say any pandemic that comes into that starts affecting a large number of people. Do you think India is in general prepared for such things, specifically in terms of medical infrastructure?
Okay, let me put it this way, that also the context here is that I obviously work, or our company works with a lot of doctors. We interact a lot with ICMR. We try to sell to ICMR, so we are a bit more privy to sort of how the decision making is happening and what they're considering. So my response is a bit more qualified than just generally having an opinion. So, right, what is happening is no country is ever prepared. You can't prepare for something that is exogenous, right? To the extent possible, what are the 4-5 things that a healthcare system needs? One, it needs enough sort of qualified physicians, doctors, nursing staff, which we don't have, even in a normal scenario, right? So from that aspect, we are not prepared for a pandemic. Do we have enough infrastructure in terms of just pure facilities, like number of beds, hospital, 4 walls, right? Like, is there enough place to place patients? Yeah, right. At least at that level, we have sufficient public and private hospitals and number of beds to cope in an emergency situation, right? That at the very least we can offer a bed to patients. It's becoming difficult now, but you go to 4 hospitals, somewhere or other you will find a bed. So there are at least enough beds, and the government has done a lot over the last 3 months to increase that number of beds. They have set up, for example, in the Bangalore Exhibition Center, they have set up 10,000 beds. So in that sense, they have created base infrastructure. Now, in terms of equipment, we did not have, because you can't prepare for every kind of disease, right? There might have been another disease that probably affected just the leg, right? And then you did not have machines for that specific disease. So that way, I don't know whether we could have ever designed or had policy to stock up enough ventilators. I don't know whether that was feasible. And then the fourth aspect of dealing with a contagious diseases, sort of contact tracing and containment and stuff. So I think in that aspect, because India has dealt with Nipah, it has dealt with tuberculosis, and we had the polio vaccination program. At least in the public sector, there is institutional sort of memory to do these kind of activities. So contact tracing, setting up containment zones. So I think we have a fairly good handle on those kind of things. So from my perspective, it's sort of a bit unfair to require of the government to be prepared for every pandemic. I think we are better off than some. And I think to a large extent, they have done a laudable job in terms of managing with what resources they had so far. Now, where the real challenge is what happens from here, which is with the lockdowns, with the time that you have bought, are you procuring the right equipment? Are you putting it in the right sort of facilities? Are you triaging right? I think that is where, again, only in 3 to 4 months will we have enough data to make a judgment. But my current opinion is that I think somewhere there is now a lag in terms of having used this time to procure the right equipment and setting up the facilities properly. I don't think that has happened as effectively.
Right. So if I was to ask you to, let's say, rate the response that Indian government gave to this pandemic, where would you put it in, let's say, 1 being very, very bad, almost not doing anything, and 5 being crazy good, right? They've done everything right. There was no step that they could have done better.
So I think since you all went to BITS, we should do relative grading. Right? So
okay, fine.
So yeah, I think I give like a C to India, but not very many people have an A or a B. So I think we are okay. I mean, it's a bad situation.
Right. So which country?
So I think South Korea is their response was incredible, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like they did contact tracing, they managed to contain it very, very quickly.
Right.
I think that was very impressive. We did a decent job on sort of the initial containment and initial contact tracing, but then obviously given the size of the country and the multiple levels at which sort of healthcare infrastructure works, right? So India has within the public sector, you have central government hospitals, you will have district level hospitals, you have the railways hospitals, you have the army hospitals. Everyone's procurement works differently. MPs have different budgets, so it's a very very fragmented procurement market as well. So for them to be able to get all of that aligned and working also has been a big challenge. So yeah, I would put us at a C. We aren't the worst of the lot, but there's a lot of scope for improvement.
Yeah, that's like lying around at the average.
Yeah, we are at the average.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the last, and I think the golden question from my end, right? Because it has been troubling me a hell lot. And I'm sure it's troubling a lot of people a hell lot, is that when and how I would put it, do you foresee the COVID situation coming to an end? I wouldn't even, ask you to sort of give a global answer, but just pertaining to India. When and how do you see this COVID thing coming to an end?
Okay, the only way for this to end completely is for there to be a vaccine, right? No two ways about it. Unless and until there is a vaccine, it's not going to go away. There's always going to be recurrence. However much you bring down the curve, there will be new pockets. So that is going to keep on happening. So I think vaccine is the key. From my limited sort of recall of what I learned in college about viruses and vaccines and stuff, it's going to be at the very least another 12 months. If we do find a successful vaccine, successful candidate, it's going to be 12 months till it's globally available, because you need to go through a stringent clinical process. You need to make sure that it's not having side effects, then manufacturing and therefore distribution. So it's going to be 12 months if we do find a successful candidate. Now, if we don't, it's going to be more, it's going to be longer. So I think India specifically needs to procure a lot more equipment, set up better treating facilities, set up better sort of referral infrastructure. That is one aspect of it. But also as a population, I think we just need to understand that we have to live with this, and therefore we need to change our behavior, wear masks, right? Make sure that we are following social distancing. We don't need to stop life altogether, but until and unless all of us develop a social consciousness that okay, we need to do these things for everybody to be safe, it doesn't make sense to sort of start life again. So I think everybody has to be very very sort of responsible and do their part so that we can start normal life while we wait for the vaccine. I don't think that's the answer you wanted, but basically we have to live with this.
So basically meaning that after we have a good candidate, after that it takes 12 months. So I mean, probably we are yet few months away from a good candidate.
Yeah, I think all the vaccines that are being talked about. So one is vaccine and one is immunotherapy. So for example, Biocan has a candidate that will sort of reduce the body's response that's killing the lung cells. So there are different sort of trajectories on which multiple vaccine candidates are being tested. So at least in 3 months, I feel at least an immuno sort of suppressant vaccine, we might get a good candidate, and then maybe in 3 months we may find either the Oxford one or the Serum Institute. I think that's the same one. Anyway, there's like multiple ones of which one may turn out to be a good one. So in 3 months we'll know whether we have a candidate or not, and if we do have one, then 12 months post that.
Right. Yes, because what makes this question important for me at least is that, of course, I mean, life has to come to a sort of cautious stop. But for most of us, being responsible is essentially translating into staying at home for very, very long periods of time, right? Very like extended periods of time.
Yeah.
And I personally believe that there's a bigger giant that we are honing under our bellies, which is a mental health issue. So many people just staying at home for very long extended periods without too much interaction with other whatever social interactions, right? Maybe going out to a vacation or things like this, or interacting with people in general. I personally feel that we might be, probably saving ourselves from COVID, but walking into a larger mental issue, mental health
Yeah,
problem in the near future.
I agree with it. Even at a personal level, obviously, it's been a bit distressing. And I have actually had, I would say, I've been fortunate that I've been able to go to the office through lockdown because we work in healthcare, we got emergency passes, and you can't build hardware sitting at home. So we had to go to office. So compared to other people in my social circle, I had a lot more interaction because I was going out, I was meeting my colleagues at office. But even then, it's been uh, obviously having an effect. So I can completely commiserate with other people who are facing issues. But I think that's where your social circle, family, those come into the picture. These are the times where you really need to bond with them and get that support.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I'm not really, sort of missing my travel in Bangalore because I used to take a bus and it was I was already living a hell of a life. Good for a few of us, who are living with our people, I would like to call it, maybe friends or family.
Yeah.
But really sad for people who are, locked down at a place where they are staying alone. Anyway, so this was I think an amazing talk. That was my last question. So Vibhav, thank you so much. Loved having you with us. Do you have something to say to our audience?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, we have 3 devices which are being directly deployed for COVID. So, let me just recap. One is a fetal monitor that can be used at home. So, we reduce the number of interactions between the mom and an infected space. The second is a product called WrapCare, which basically is used for people who are on the ventilator to remove secretions that pool up so that they don't get infections that can lead to death. And the third is SARS Pro, which is, as we said, a non-invasive CPAP ventilation device. And we have a lot of hospitals who are treating COVID patients, but because of bad procurement policies or lack of funds or uncertainty or whatever, they are not in a position to buy. But the hospital or the doctors there want the devices. So we have set up a system where people can donate. So if any one of you is interested in donating a unit or you know a hospital which may be interested, please get in touch with us. We can set up a donation for you to a hospital that needs it, or we can donate a device along with you to a hospital that you may want to donate to. So please reach out. Please help us. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. Okay. Thank you so much, Vibhav. It was an amazing talk. And to all the people out there, I think it's necessary to take care of your mental health and do your responsibility bit so that we don't, make the situation worse than what it is right now.
Yeah. Like, please be careful. I've seen COVID patients. I've seen a COVID ward. It's not a pretty picture. Please avoid having to be somebody who ends up there. So take care.
Yeah, comes from the man himself. Thanks a lot. With this, we wrap our podcast on COVID Talk series with Vibhav Joshi. Thanks a lot, Vibhav.